Focus. Oh, gotcha. Hello, my name is Mo, and I thought today I'd talk to you about why I'm no longer a fan of Sam Harris. So who is Sam Harris? He is a philosopher and neuroscientist. He has written multiple books and hosts his own podcast, and he's well known for talking about things like religion, ethics, and politics. But before I talk about Sam Harris, I feel like I should give you a little bit of background. When I was 13, I became really interested in religion, atheism, and philosophy. Honestly, I think it was just because I was really depressed and wanted to know how the world worked or why it was the way it was, so I could have some sort of answer to why I was sad. Of course, I never got an answer, because there is no answer. Well, not in my view anyway. But I was fascinated by all this. I still am. And so during that time, I discovered the works of people like Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and Sam Harris, who is of course the topic of today. I'd watch videos in which these guys destroyed creationists, and I'd listen to them talk together about religion for hours. This was an online space I inhabited for years, and I only really came out of it recently. Despite still being very interested in philosophy and all that good stuff, I haven't really actively engaged with any of Sam Harris's work for a few years now, so I wasn't really in the loop. The lens in which I saw him was rose-tinted, if you will. The reason I used to watch him was for his takedowns on religion. I was a kid, a teenager, and at that point I wasn't particularly interested in politics, so I hadn't seen much of his other work. But an episode of his podcast popped up onto my recommended. It was an episode talking about Black Lives Matter and systematic racism, and I thought, I haven't watched anything from Sam Harris in a few years now. I wonder what he's up to. So I clicked on it. I clicked on this video here, and I listened to it. I listened to the whole thing, and afterwards I just sat there. I sat there for a bit, and I was like, what? In short, I didn't like it, and I'll get into those reasons in a moment, because after listening to the podcast, I did a little more research on Sam Harris. I listened to some more talks he'd done on race, and I discovered that in 2017, Sam Harris had actually hosted on his podcast a controversial social scientist by the name of Charles Murray. Charles Murray is a political scientist who has written and talked about in length the differences in race and intelligence. Basically, he's a massive racist. So in the podcast, Harris and Murray discussed the heritability of IQ in relation to race. Harris stated it was out of indignation at the violent protest against Murray at the Millbury College the previous month, and not because he had any particular interest in the subject. Which was something that bothered me about this conversation, actually. It was framed as if it was some sort of free speech statement. The concept of forbidden knowledge is an enticing one. But really, if we break it down, what do we have? I know I'm using idpol, so shoot me, but two white men sitting in a room together discussing if and why black people as a group are less intelligent than white people. Doesn't seem so alluring now, does it? But of course, Sam Harris has every right to invite whoever he wants onto his podcast, but if he's going to be inviting people like Charles Murray, he should expect some criticism. And with that, allow me to criticise him. To add more context to my criticism, let me play you a clip from the aforementioned podcast.
People don't want to hear that intelligence is a real thing, and that some people have more of it than others. They don't want to hear that IQ tests really measure it. They don't want to hear that differences in IQ matter. People don't want to hear this. And they certainly don't want to hear that average IQ differs across races and ethnic groups.
This racial IQ gap exists only in a technical sense. The reason it even exists in the first place is due to an overwhelming amount of socio-economic factors. Allow me to enlighten you with some information, but race isn't real. Well, it is, but not in the way that people think it is. Race is purely a social construct. I can't believe I'm saying this, as this is something so basic I learned it in Year 13 biology. There is no genetic or biological legitimacy to race. A black person could share more genes in common with a white person than another black person. I don't know if you've ever heard of this thing called the out of Africa theory of human evolution, but it states that we all originally came from Africa. Now, there are a couple of other theories, but this is the most widely believed theory. Researchers have produced DNA evidence that strongly backs it up. This means that, ironically, aside from the fact that we all originally came from Africa, black people actually have more genetic diversity than any other racial group. So the fact that Sam Harris even gives this topic the time of day is disappointing to say the least. Intelligence is complicated, it's subjective, and it's abstract. There are many different types of intelligence. A scientist is going to have a different type of intelligence to an artist. The idea that we, as humans, could come up with a single test that measures how intelligent we are is so overwhelmingly arrogant, I don't know what to say. So the fact that he entertains this idea that the test could show differences in intelligence on a racial level is ridiculous. In my opinion, if you're intent on investigating the link between the intelligence of racial groups that cannot of course be separated on any genetic level, well then I think there's probably an ulterior motive at play. And I cannot think of any other than racism. But let me bring you back to the podcast I mentioned earlier. The podcast that set me on this journey. In episode 207, Sam Harris discusses racism and police violence in relation to the recent Black Lives Matter protests. He talks about it in terms of racist individuals, or an ambient level of racism, referring to racist culture within the police force. The podcast episode is 2 hours long, so I'm not going to be running through the full thing. There are people who've done that far better than I ever could anyway. But I will be discussing some of the biggest contentions I have with it. If you do want to see a full breakdown of the episode, however, I would highly recommend going and watching Peter Hanink's response to it. I'll leave a link in the description. He's a criminologist and his response was honestly brilliant. It is very long, but it goes into a lot of depth, so if you want to listen to someone who actually knows their stuff, that's what I'd suggest. I've actually used some of the points he made, so full credit to him there. Hanink makes this statement which honestly just sums up a lot of my feelings towards Sam Harris. He says, the jumps that he makes in his arguments and the data he uses are often presented outside of the context in which they emerge, and doesn't pay attention to the decades of research that has preceded them.
And so it's the kind of the curse of the autodidact, right? The autodidact can be very, very bright, can be very, very clever, but the autodidact only knows what they've read. They don't know what they haven't read. They don't have a teacher who can say, well, yes, it's very important that you found X, Y, and Z, but you haven't bothered to look at A through W.
Sam Harris is operating outside his area of expertise, and it shows. So as intelligent as he is, he's almost by definition an autodidact. So Sam Harris is talking about systemic racism. What is systemic racism and how does it occur? Because interestingly enough, Sam never defined systemic racism, despite that being one of the main talking points of the podcast. Put simply, systemic racism is the result of the inherent bias and prejudices of the policies and practices of social and political organisations, groups, or institutions. So systemic racism means that there are racist consequences to institutions, practices, or laws. The system itself is built on racist ideals. This means that theoretically you could have a police force with no racist individuals, while the repercussions of this said force still have a racist effect on the community. This is because systemic racism doesn't rely on individuals. And this isn't a crazy theory either. This is academic consensus. Now, since I know a lot of you probably won't watch this video the whole way through, I want to start with what is perhaps the biggest punch of all. Sam Harris says this.
Blacks are 13% of the population, but they commit at least 50% of the murders and other violent crimes. If you have 13% of the population responsible for 50% of the murders, and in some cities committing 2/3 of all violent crime, what percent of police attention should it attract? I honestly don't know, but I'm pretty sure it's not just 13%.
He did it. He really just went and evoked the 1350 meme. When I heard that, my jaw just dropped. I was like, no way, no. He'll elaborate on that, right? He'll go into the socio-economic factors that contribute to that statistic, won't he? But he never did. Is this perhaps because it would actually entail him addressing the effects of systemic racism? I don't know. I want to be charitable, but he's making it really hard. So since he never addresses the socio-economic factors here, allow me to do so instead. The phrase 13% of black people commit more than 50% of the violent crime is often framed as evidence to show there is something inherent to blackness which makes them more violent and likely to offend. The phrase 1350 is quite literally used as a white supremacist dog whistle. And of course, black people are not inherently any more susceptible to crime than white people. To indicate otherwise ignores all the history that has brought us to this point. Now, the first thing to address here is, according to the Bureau of Justice, the rate of black on black crime is 63%, while white on white crime is 56%. That is approximately an 8% difference. I'm willing to bet that surprised a few of you. We hear about huge differences and, well, 8% isn't that huge. But you know, it is still a difference, of course. So let's discuss that. Why is there this disparity? Okay, so let's go into some more statistics from the Bureau of Justice. Here they state, surprise, surprise, there is a correlation between poverty and crime. So with that in mind, according to the current population survey from the US Census Bureau, black people have a poverty rate of 20.8%, while white people have a poverty rate of 10.1%. That means that black people have double the rate of poverty than white people. Interesting that. Interesting how when you actually start to unpack the data, the statistics, all the little factors at play that contribute to the wider picture. It's interesting how once you do that, things start to look quite different. Oh, and hey, do you want to know another little fun fact? Just one more nail in the coffin that is already cemented shut. Poor black people in urban areas have similar crime rates to poor white people in urban areas. And do you want to know something even more interesting? Poor black people in urban areas have a crime rate of 51.3 per 1,000, while poor white people in urban areas have a crime rate of 56.4 per 1,000. Now let me say that all to you again, really clearly, so the people in the back can hear. Poor white people in urban areas actually have a higher crime rate than poor black people in urban areas. So why am I telling you that? After all, this is only accounting for poor people in urban areas. But that's the thing. When you count for different variables, you start to see the bigger picture. Everything I have just shown you proves that race is not the real issue when it comes to crime. The real underlying issues are, of course, that of poverty and systemic racism. But Sam Harris doesn't mention any of this since it doesn't fit his narrative. In fact, I highly doubt he even bothered to research any of this. I know that if I'm going to be talking on a subject as serious as this, I need to get my facts right. Unfortunately, we are at a place in society in which people choose to ignore the nuance and the facts because it is easier to just paint black people as the problem than it is to make change. If we point to statistics without the full context and just yell 1350, we can dismiss the real issues like poverty, a lack of jobs and resources and equal opportunities. And hey, the data is in, folks. We need systemic change, and maybe, just maybe, if we actually made an effort to fix things, there wouldn't be so many black people in poverty who feel like they have nothing to lose in turning to a life of crime in the first place. But moving on, 44 minutes in, Sam Harris says this.
But in the last 25 years, violent crime has come down significantly in the U.S., and so has the police use of deadly force. But the public perception is, of course, completely different. I mean, in a city like Los Angeles, 2019 was a 30-year low for police shootings.
So, Sam Harris states that statistics from Los Angeles showed that LAPD shootings hit a 30-year low in 2019. But again, he leaves out some key points of information. If we look at those statistics, we see that there were 26 police shootings, right? Of those shootings, 15 were Latino, 2 were white, and 8 were black. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit more. 58% of the shootings were Latino, so that would indicate that Latinos were most likely to be shot, right? No, because we aren't taking into account population percentage. So let's go into that. Latinos make up 48% of the LA population, so that seems a little bit disproportionate, right? Let's keep going. 8% of the shootings were white, and white people make up 30% of the LA population. Now that's very disproportionate. So what about black people? Black people make up 10% of LA's population. Yet according to the very statistics that Sam cites, they make up 31% of the shootings. Well, quite evidently, that's disproportionate. Now you could argue that this is just one city in 1 year and it doesn't really prove anything. That could be a valid argument too, but you'd be wasting your time if you tried to make it, because that's not the point I'm trying to get across. What I'm trying to show you is how the way in which you present your data can tell a very different story. And Sam Harris seems to conveniently leave out the aspects of the data that doesn't fit his narrative. There is something Hanink mentions in his video that I think really highlights the fact that there is a level of bad faith in which Sam Harris is tackling this topic, whether he realises it or not. This occurs 25 minutes into the podcast when Sam Harris says there is a half quote from Dr. Martin Luther King circling around that says, "Riots are the language of the unheard." But Sam Harris claims this half quote leaves out a part in which Dr. King states he believes that riots hurt the cause of the black community and helps the cause of racists.
Many people have been circulating a half quote from Martin Luther King Jr. about riots being the language of the unheard. They're leaving out the part where he made it clear that he believed that riots harmed the cause of the black community and helped the cause of racists.
Now I really want to focus on the phrase, helps the cause of racists. So keep that in your head, because I think it's important. The name of the speech in question is The Other America, and Sam Harris has, well, he's left out some context. Martin Luther King says this.
But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. What is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention.
Nowhere does he say that riots help the cause of racists. Martin Luther King says that shouts of black power are the consequence of the backlash rather than the cause of them. So ironically, when Sam Harris claims that Martin Luther King thought that riots were helping the cause of racists, it is he who is misquoting Dr. King. But don't misinterpret me. I'm not claiming that Martin Luther King didn't condemn riots, because he did. He famously preached non-violence, of course. But here is what he really says.
That riots are socially destructive and self-defeating, I'm still convinced that nonviolence is the most potent weapon available to oppress people in their struggle for freedom and justice.
So, Martin Luther King says he condemns riots, but riots are the language of the unheard. Now you might say I'm nitpicking here, but there is a big difference in believing riots aren't the answer and believing riots help the cause of racists. The reason I'm even talking about this is because I think it shows how Sam Harris is interpreting things the way he wants them to be. A theme I found to be present throughout this podcast. And of course, let's not forget what is perhaps the most famous Martin Luther King quote of all.
That over the past few years I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom.
But moving on again, at 1 hour and 7 minutes, Sam Harris says that people need to stop resisting arrest.
Don't understand how to behave around cops so as to keep themselves safe. People have to stop resisting arrest.
This is a common sentiment I hear among people who criticise the Black Lives Matter movement or are sceptical of police brutality. It is a way to delegitimise the experiences of people who have been victims to such treatment. And really, I must ask, why? Why do people feel the need to say this? Because don't you think black people already know? Of course they already know. Come on. Don't be so condescending. Is he really so arrogant as to assume they don't already know this? Has he not spoken to a single black person? Has he not seen the videos on Twitter and YouTube where black parents talk about how they've had to explain to their kids how to deal with the police? I want to play you an excerpt from another podcast he did because I really can't stress enough how... I don't want to say stupid because he is a 53-year-old neuroscientist and philosopher, and I am an 18-year-old with what? So no, I don't want to be so arrogant as to call him stupid, but this thing he says here, this is pretty stupid.
At minimum, we have a cultural problem that has to be solved. And only the black community can really solve it. And on some level, understanding the origins, even if we knew that the origin of the problem was white racism. We have slavery, we have Jim Crow, and then we have a direct, line of falling dominoes to the problem of inner city violence, for, black teenagers. Let's just say that was true. That still doesn't tell you what the remedy is now.
He genuinely just said, black people have to solve their own inequality. It's all up to them. If they just change their culture, they're not going to be subjected to racism? Is that it? I'm sorry, perhaps I'm missing something here, because this isn't the type of thing I'd expect from an intellectual such as Sam Harris. This is something I'd expect from a 15-year-old Ben Shapiro fan. If we want to solve the problems he's talking about, we don't just leave it up to the minority. We do things like decriminalise cannabis, end the war on drugs. We fund the education system, we fund housing, we invest money into public health. None of what I'm saying here is new. None of what I'm saying is revolutionary. I'm just listening to people who know more than me. And I think perhaps Sam Harris should start doing that too, because this is clearly not a topic he is well versed in. Now, we have arrived to the last point I'm going to discuss. At 1 hour and 40 minutes, Sam Harris offers his opinion on what progress would look like in terms of racism.
What would real progress on the problem of racism look like? What would utter progress look like? Well, here's what I think it would look like. More and more people, and ultimately all people, would care less and less, and ultimately not at all, about race. As I've said in various places, skin color would become like hair color in its political and moral significance.
The solution is not just to treat everyone as individuals, as he claims, because, as we have already discussed, some individuals have a head start. Of course, we need to afford everyone the same respect and treat people based upon their merits and not their phenotypic traits. But systematic racism means that black people will still be disadvantaged. It's the system we need to change. Ignoring colour isn't going to help black people. It's going to enable systemic racism. Only after we have tackled the issues of systemic racism can we even begin to start doing what Sam Harris suggests. So to summarise my feelings on this, I guess what I'd say is this. Sam Harris has demonstrated, to me at least, that he doesn't understand systemic racism. The narrative he is pushing here is a dangerous one. Negating the importance and prevalence of systemic racism not only goes against academic consensus, but it gives value to those who hold racist beliefs. Now, to make it abundantly clear, I'm not accusing Sam Harris of being racist, because at the end of the day, I can never truly know what he believes. But Sam Harris is using his massive platform to levy hollow criticisms at what is potentially a massive catalyst for change. Change to a racist system. Change that would have a positive effect on so many communities. It's irresponsible, and you know what? I'm disappointed. I really thought he was better than that. But oh well, what can you do? So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Feel free to subscribe if you want. I don't say that often, it makes me cringe a bit, but go ahead. If you have any criticisms or you think I've misinterpreted what Sam Harris was saying at any point, please do leave it in the comments below. Let's try and have a respectful discussion. But yeah, have a good day, stay safe, see ya.